In previous episodes, we've examined liquidity, we've examined solvency, we've examined leverage pressure, we've examined income resilience, we've examined flexibility and optionality. But there is another dimension of financial strength that is often overlooked. A household can have positive cash flow, a household can have low debt, a household can have healthy emergency funds, and yet still be heading toward future financial stress. Why? Because future obligations still require funding. In this video, we introduce one of the most important concepts within the household financial operating system, funding adequacy. Funding adequacy answers a simple question. Has sufficient capital been allocated today to satisfy the obligations of tomorrow? Because the future is not free, the future arrives with invoices. Many households mistakenly believe that positive monthly cash flow represents financial success. If income exceeds expenses, everything must be fine. But that assumption ignores timing. Imagine a household that earns $6,000 per month and spends $5,500 per month. Every month they generate a surplus of $500. At first glance, everything appears healthy. Yet consider what lies ahead. A vehicle replacement in 5 years, a roof replacement in 10 years, retirement in 20 years, children entering post-secondary education, future healthcare expenses, emergency events. If the monthly surplus is consumed rather than allocated, future obligations remain unfunded. The household can be profitable today while simultaneously becoming financially weaker tomorrow. Positive cash flow is important, but positive cash flow alone doesn't create future readiness. Funding does. One of the most powerful mindset shifts in personal finance is recognizing that many so-called emergencies are entirely predictable. A vehicle eventually wears out, a furnace eventually fails, a roof eventually needs replacement, retirement eventually arrives, children eventually grow up. These events are not surprises. Their exact timing may be uncertain, but their existence is not. What creates financial stress is often not the event itself. It is the absence of preparation. Funding adequacy reframes these events. Rather than viewing them as future crises, we recognize them as future obligations, and future obligations require current capital allocation. A useful way to think about funding adequacy is through future funding buckets. Every major future obligation should have a corresponding capital allocation pathway. Examples include a retirement fund, the largest future obligation most households will ever face. Retirement is essentially a period where expenses continue while employment income disappears. If retirement is not funded, future optionality collapses. Secondly, a vehicle replacement fund. Vehicles depreciate. Eventually, they must be replaced. A household that continually finances vehicles may create recurring leverage pressure. A household that gradually funds replacement capital reduces future debt dependence. Next, a home maintenance fund. Roofs, windows, driveways, appliances, furnaces, water heaters. Every physical asset requires maintenance. The question is not whether expenses will occur. The question is whether funding exists when they do. Education funds. Education may create substantial future cash requirements. Funding can occur gradually over years rather than through future borrowing. Emergency reserves. Unexpected events still occur. Funding adequacy requires capital buffers for uncertainty. And healthcare reserves. Healthcare costs often rise later in life. Future planning requires recognizing these obligations before they arrive. Every dollar of surplus faces a decision: consume today or fund tomorrow. Neither choice is inherently wrong, but every choice carries consequences. The household that allocates surplus toward future obligations gradually increases resilience. The household that allocates all surplus toward current consumption gradually increases future vulnerability. This is why funding adequacy is closely connected to optionality. Future freedom is purchased through present allocation. The more future obligations become funded, the greater the range of choices available later. Optionality is often misunderstood. Many people think optionality comes from income. Income certainly helps, but optionality comes from accumulated capital. A person with substantial funded reserves possesses flexibility. They can change careers, reduce working hours, start a business, relocate, retire earlier, or pursue opportunities. The individual with identical income but no funded reserves possesses fewer choices. Funding adequacy creates optionality because future obligations become less threatening. The more future obligations are funded, the fewer future decisions become constrained by financial necessity. Most financial decisions are evaluated in 3 dimensions. What is happening right now? Funding adequacy introduces time. It forces us to ask, what must this system support 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now? This is where financial planning becomes forecasting, and forecasting becomes systems thinking. The household is no longer viewed as a collection of current transactions. It becomes a living system extending through time. Up to this point, we've discussed funding adequacy conceptually, but within the household financial operating system, every dimension must ultimately become measurable. Otherwise, it cannot be monitored, it cannot be benchmarked, and it cannot be improved. This is why funding adequacy becomes the 6th dimension of our household financial architectural spider graph. The 6 dimensions of our framework include liquidity runway, solvency, income resilience, which is the topic of the next video, leverage pressure, flexibility and optionality, funding adequacy. Each dimension evaluates a different aspect of household strength. Liquidity asks, can the system survive? Solvency asks, can the system withstand its liabilities? Income resilience asks, can the inflows continue? Leverage pressure asks, how much stress is being imposed on the structure? Flexibility asks, how many choices remain available? And this flexibility relates to recurring surplus. And then funding adequacy asks, has the future already been funded? Funding adequacy is fundamentally a comparison between the capital required and the capital already allocated for future obligations. Conceptually, the funding adequacy ratio is equal to the funded future capital divided by the required future capital. So a household that requires $1 million for retirement, $50,000 for vehicle replacement, $75,000 for healthcare reserves, $75,000 for education, and $25,000 for emergency reserves would require $1,225,000 of future funding. If current funding reserves total $612,500, then the funding adequacy ratio would be $612,500 divided by $1,225,000, which equals 50%. The household has funded half of its known future obligations. A household might score 90 on liquidity, for solvency 85, income resilience 80, leverage pressure 75, flexibility 70, and funding adequacy 20. This creates an important insight. The household appears healthy today, but future obligations remain largely unfunded. The spider graph immediately reveals the weakness. Conversely, another household may score 75 on liquidity, for solvency 80, income resilience 80, leverage pressure 80, flexibility 85, and funding adequacy 90. The current situation may look similar, but the future trajectory is dramatically different. Most financial ratios are backward-looking. They evaluate where the household is today. Funding adequacy is different. It evaluates preparedness for tomorrow. It is the dimension that introduces time into the architecture. It transforms the spider graph from a snapshot of current health into a map of future readiness. Because a household can be liquid, a household can be solvent, a household can even have positive cash flow and still be underfunded. Funding adequacy ensures that our framework does not merely evaluate present strength, it evaluates future preparedness, and ultimately that is what financial planning is supposed to accomplish. Not merely surviving today, but ensuring that tomorrow is already funded. At this point, you may be thinking, wait a second, wouldn't younger households naturally have very low funding adequacy ratios? And the answer is yes. If we can simply compare current accumulated capital to the final future capital target, younger households will almost always appear underfunded. Imagine two people both targeting $1 million for retirement. A 25-year-old may have accumulated $50,000. Meanwhile, a 60-year-old may have accumulated $700,000. Under a simple funded status measurement, the older individual appears dramatically stronger. But that comparison may be misleading. The younger individual may be perfectly on track. The older individual may actually be behind schedule. The issue is that accumulated balances alone do not tell us whether the household is currently behaving in a way that will achieve its future objectives. And ultimately, behavior is what drives outcomes. A stronger measurement asks a different question. Instead of asking, how much have you accumulated, we ask, how much should you have accumulated by now? This shifts funding adequacy from a static balance sheet measure into a dynamic forecasting measure. The process works as follows. First, we identify the future funding objective. For example, retirement may be $1 million, vehicle replacement $30,000, education fund $75,000, healthcare reserve $50,000. Next, we estimate the time remaining, the expected rate of return, and required periodic contributions. From this, we calculate the target contribution schedule needed to achieve the future objective. This becomes our funding plan. Now we can calculate a much more powerful ratio. The funding adequacy ratio was equal to the actual contributions divided by the target contributions. Or alternatively, funding adequacy ratio is equal to the actual fund value divided by the target fund value at this point in time. A score of 100% means you're exactly on plan, 110% means you are ahead of plan, 90% means you are slightly behind plan, 70% means future objectives are increasingly at risk. Notice what has happened. Age no longer matters, income no longer matters, current wealth no longer matters. What matters is whether your current behavior is sufficient to achieve your future objectives. This is ultimately what we want from this dimension to capture. The spider graph should not simply tell us where the household stands today. It should tell us whether today's actions are likely to produce tomorrow's outcomes. Funding adequacy, therefore, becomes less about accumulated wealth and more about funding discipline. It measures whether the household is allocating sufficient capital today to satisfy future obligations tomorrow. In other words, liquidity measures survivability, solvency measures structural strength, income resilience measures inflow stability, which we will get to, leverage pressure measures financial stress, flexibility or recurring surplus measures available choices, and funding adequacy measures whether today's behavior is sufficient to fund the future. And that makes it one of the most forward-looking dimensions in the entire household financial operating system. Throughout this season, we've gradually built a framework for understanding household financial strength. We began with recurring surplus, because before anything else can happen, the household must consistently generate excess inflows beyond ongoing outflows. Recurring surplus is the fuel that powers the system. Without surplus, there is nothing available to save, invest, allocate, or fund. We then examined liquidity runway, because generating surplus is not enough if the household cannot survive temporary shocks. Liquidity determines how long the system can continue functioning when circumstances become difficult. Next, we explored fixed cost rigidity, because flexibility matters. The greater the percentage of income committed to unavoidable lifestyle obligations, the less adaptable the household becomes when conditions change. We then examined leverage pressure, because debt servicing and household obligations create structural demands on future cash flow. As leverage pressures rise, optionality declines. And finally, in this episode, we examined funding adequacy. The first four dimensions largely evaluate the present. Funding adequacy evaluates the future. It asks whether today's behavior is sufficient to satisfy tomorrow's obligations. Because eventually the future arrives. Retirement arrives, vehicle replacement and maintenance arrive, education expenses arrive, healthcare expenses arrive, major purchases arrive, opportunities arrive. The question is not whether these obligations will appear. The question is whether capital will be waiting when they do. What makes funding adequacy unique is that it introduces forecasting directly into the architecture. Rather than simply asking, how much have I accumulated, we ask, am I currently contributing enough to achieve the future outcomes I desire? That distinction matters. A younger household with modest assets may be perfectly on track. An older household with substantial assets may be significantly behind plan. Because balances alone do not determine future outcomes. Behavior does. Contributions do. Capital allocation does. Funding adequacy measures whether current behavior is aligned with future objectives. And that makes it one of the most forward-looking dimensions in the entire household financial operating system. When viewed together, the spider graph now tells a powerful story. Recurring surplus asks, is the system generating fuel? Liquidity runway asks, can the system survive? Fixed cost rigidity asks, can the system adapt? Leverage pressure asks, how much stress is the structure carrying? Funding adequacy asks, is the future being financed? Together, these dimensions provide a far richer picture of financial strength than income, net worth, or debt levels alone. Because strong households are not defined by a single number. They are defined by the interaction of multiple systems operating simultaneously. But one critical question still remains unanswered. Even if a household generates surplus, even if it maintains liquidity, remains flexible, even if leverage pressure is manageable, and even if future obligations are being funded, there's still one remaining vulnerability. What happens if the income itself changes? What happens if employment is lost? What happens if an industry declines? What happens if commissions disappear? What happens if clients leave? What happens if a health event interrupts earning capacity? In other words, how durable are the inflows that support the entire system? That question leads us directly into the next and sixth final dimension.